Welcome back. Liberalism. It's a pregnant word and description. We've done a lot of work here trying to or attempting to define conservatism, but as Rob from Surprise called in earlier in the week, perhaps it would be good to define liberalism. I agree. As Abraham Lincoln said about the word liberty, we all use the same word, but we may not all mean the same thing. I suppose we start with the notion that often enough, conservatives will say they are classical liberals. I've always thought that a little odd and not quite right. It's complicated, but here's why. It comes off to me as if liberalism or being liberal is the right thing to be, the thing we should all aspire to. Oh, we may not agree with what liberalism has become, but we are classical liberals. We are what liberals used to say they were, almost as if there's something wrong with not being a liberal or a kind of liberal. As if liberalism should be the default or the destination, the territory we should all occupy or live in, be it new liberalism, neoliberalism, old liberalism, classical liberalism. As if being not liberal or being a conservative is the wrong thing to be, the regrettable thing, the undesirable thing, the embarrassing thing, the thing we have to apologize for. As if being a conservative today is really just being what a liberal once was. As if we're all supposed to be some kind of liberal. As if not being a liberal or some kind of liberal is to be shamed. Of course, if I'm right, it means we haven't done a great job in establishing conservatism as equally or more respectable than liberalism. Even the moderates among our party give us a little credit on this front, but then default back to type when they say such things as, well, I'm an economic conservative, but a social liberal, or a social liberal and a fiscal conservative. Again, as if conservatism really should only apply to matters of money or finance, while in life and sociology, liberalism should be the dominant ethos. At least such a sentiment puts in a good word for liberalism, I suppose, fiscal. Barry Goldwater got at some of this in his book Conscience of a Conservative as far back in 1960, writing, quote, "Perhaps we suffer from the judgments of those who rule the mass communications media. We are daily consigned by enlightened commentators to political oblivion. Conservatism, we are told, is out of date. The charge is preposterous," he writes, "and we ought boldly say so. The laws of God and of nature have no dateline," he went on. "The principles on which the conservative political position is based have been established by a process that has nothing to do with social, economic, and political landscapes that change from decade to decade and from century to century." He continues, "These principles are derived from the nature of man and from the truths that God has revealed about his creation. Circumstances change, so do the problems that are shaped by circumstances, but the principles that govern the solution of the problems do not. To suggest that conservative philosophy is out of date is akin to saying that the Golden Rule or the Ten Commandments or Aristotle's Politics are out of date. The conservative approach is nothing more or less than an attempt to apply the wisdom and experience and the revealed truths to the problems of today. The challenge is not to find a new set or different level of truth, but to learn how to apply established truths to the problems of the contemporary world." Quite right, old Barry Goldwater was. But of course the problem is few conservatives talk this way about conservatism. We usually go straight to the margins, like taxes or specific social issues or spending. We go to the retail issues du jour, not the wholesale issues from time immemorial, one might say. And Barry Goldwater was not the first to note this. Just a few years prior, in establishing National Review magazine, William Buckley understood the challenge of dominant liberal left culture when he wrote this about the founding of National Review, 5 years before Goldwater's book. He wrote, "We are out of place in the sense that the United Nations and the League of Women Voters and the New York Times and Henry Still Commager, famous liberal of the time, are in place. Conservatism," Buckley went on, "is out of place because in its maturity, literate America rejected conservatism in favor of radical social experimentalism. Instead of covetously consolidating its premises, the United States seems tormented by its tradition of fixed postulates having to do with the meaning of existence, with the relationship of the state to the individual to his neighbor, so clearly enunciated in the establishing documents of our republic. Excuse me. Buckley went on, quote, "I happen to prefer champagne to ditch water," said Oliver Wendell Holmes, "but there is no reason to suppose that the cosmos has that preference. We have come around to Mr. Holmes's view so much so that we feel gentlemanly doubts when asserting the superiority of capitalism to socialism, of republicanism to centralism, of conservatism to liberalism, of champagne to ditch water, of anything to anything. The inroads that relativism has made on the American soul are not so easily evident. One must recently have lived on or close to a college campus to have a vivid imagination as to what has happened. It is there that we should see how a number of energetic social innovators, plugging their grand designs, succeeded over the years in capturing the liberal intellectual imagination. And since ideas rule the world, the ideologues, having won over the intellectual class, simply walked in and started to run things, and run just about everything they have." Close quote. Buckley was up against it, as conservatism was. Lionel Trilling in 1950 was perhaps the most well-known public intellectual in America at the time, akin to someone like a Carl Sagan a couple decades ago. It's hard to find an analog because we haven't had public intellectuals like Lionel Trilling in a while, but Trilling was as respected as they come back then. He wrote, think of like David McCullough meets Christopher Hitchens meets Victor Davis Hanson, I suppose. Anyway, Trilling wrote famously in 1950, "In the United States at this time, liberalism is not only the dominant, but even the sole intellectual tradition. For it is the plain fact that nowadays there are no conservative or reactionary ideas in general circulation. This does not mean," he went on, "of course, that there is no impulse to conservatism or to reaction. Such impulses are certainly very strong, perhaps even stronger than most of us know. But the conservative impulse and the reactionary impulse do not, with some isolated and ecclesiastical exceptions, express themselves in ideas, but only in action or in irritable mental gestures which seek to resemble ideas." Close quote. That's what they were talking about us, how they were talking about us in the 50s. Now go back to what Buckley wrote about how out of step conservatism was for a moment and consider how much more true it is today. How much more of the culture does liberal leftism run now than in the 1950s? Corporate America and maybe 75% of the universities were conservative in the 1950s. So was Hollywood, and so were about a quarter of the nation's newspapers, including the Arizona Republic. So were elementary and secondary schools. No more, none of them anymore. They are all liberal left now. All the more reason, I suppose, to think we need doff our hats to liberalism, or its general acceptance and rightness and desire to be part of it, if not as it is presently constituted, then at least that what we have termed liberalism of yore, liberalism of the past, good liberalism or classical liberalism. How is classical liberalism defined? Many think of it as Enlightenment ethics, or Thomas Jefferson, the elevation of the mind and soul and individual freedom and conscience and freedom of commerce. Yoram Hazony helps this way. He says, classical liberalism differs from conservatism this way. The liberal tradition comes from Hobbes and Locke, who were not empiricists but rationalists. Their aim was to deduce universally valid political principles from self-evident axioms, as in mathematics. In his second treatise on government in the 17th century, John Locke asserts that universal reason teaches the same political truths to all human beings, that all individuals are by nature free and equal, and that obligation to political institutions arises only from the consent of the individual. From these assumptions, Locke deduces a political doctrine that he supposes must hold good in all times and all places. The term classical liberal came into use in the 20th century America to distinguish the supporters of old-school laissez-faire from the welfare state liberalism of FDR. Modern classical liberals, inheriting the rationalism of Hobbes and Locke, believe they can speak authoritatively to the political needs of every human society everywhere. Friedrich Hayek, perhaps one of the leading classical liberal theorists of the 20th century, argued for replacing independent nations with a worldwide federation, saying the abrogation of national sovereignties and the creation of an effective international order of law is a necessary complement and the logical consummation of the liberal program. Classical liberalism thus offered ground for imposing a singular doctrine on all peoples for their own good. It provides an ideological basis for an American universal dominion. Now note the problem here. The problem here being that Americanism, never mind American dominion, is a contemptible or contemptible notion to most leftists today. Back in 1988, perhaps that was about the last year one could find more than 3 honest public liberals, but one might have thought of Leonard Bernstein as one of them. Sort of. I say sort of because he called himself a liberal, but was, you will recall, a big supporter and through fundraisers for the Black Panthers, a militant and revolutionary Marxist organization. Nonetheless, he called himself a liberal and tried to rescue the word liberalism from the Republicans who were using it against Michael Dukakis in a famous op-ed in 1988 in the New York Times, writing this: I want to redefine the word liberal, not run from it or cower defensively at its insulting abuse, but proudly to clarify it. The word derives from the Latin liber, meaning free. From this word, liberal, we derive the word liberty, which is what the civilized world has been struggling for throughout its history, whether through reform or revolution, including our own revolution. George Washington was a revolutionary, as were Jefferson and Franklin, Bernstein tells us. They and the other founders strove for liberty above all. All these forefathers were therefore liberals. Let me just stop and pause for a moment to insert, yes, they were revolutionaries, but revolutionaries for freedom and equality, as, say, Jesus might have been a revolutionary for love, or Martin Luther King a revolutionary for equality in the 1960s. It wasn't revolutionaryism in the defense of extremism, or extremism in the defense of extremism, or revolutionaryism in the defense of revolutionaryism. It was revolutionaryism and extremism in the defense of liberty, if I may. Back to Bernstein, and this is really important. He writes in 1988, quote, the word liberal has been debased, defamed, and totally misused by powerful interests that have sought ever greater and more authoritarian power. Liberal is a word soiled by the greedy, reactionary, backward-looking impulse toward tyranny. Here are just 2 out of, alas, dozens of examples in our own America and in our own century, Bernstein writes. First, the hateful Red Scare, invented and perpetrated by William Randolph Hearst in the first decades of the century and magnified throughout his countless newspapers and magazines to a panic, in which anyone with a beard probably was a Bolshevik with a bomb in his pocket aimed at you, and in which merely a Russian novel rendered you suspect and potentially treasonous. Second example, even more hateful and infinitely more dangerous, was the rise of McCarthyism of the 1950s, a rise so steady and strong that only a prolonged television hearing could expose the despicable junior senator from Wisconsin for the power-greedy psychopath he was. This is arguably the closest we have come to tyranny, Bernstein writes. Full stop. If Bernstein were alive today, here is what I would tell him. The word conservatism has been debased, defamed, and totally misused by powerful interests that have sought even greater and more authoritarian power, sir. It is the movement backward looking toward tyranny, China, Iran, Hamas, you name it, that is now firmly where the left and liberalism is. And as for examples of homegrown tyranny, the press in one or a few hands with a singular ideology like Hearst was once upon a time, that's the left today, not we conservatives. Name me a conservative newspaper. One. McCarthyism, you say? Name me a leftist argufier who has been canceled, who isn't welcome on every campus or in any Hollywood studio. And now name me a conservative who hasn't been and isn't. Here's the gig, and it's my favorite part of Bernstein's op-ed. He writes this literally, quote, Who stood guard and still stands guard against sweatshops, child labor, racism, bigotry? Lovers of freedom and enemies of tyranny do. Liberals do. Close quote. To which I say, they support it all now. They support now the liberals, sweatshops, child labor, racism, bigotry. And if you're against those things, you're a conservative. Be proud of it and don't cower for saying so. Whatever classical liberalism or liberalism once was, it yielded to as if it was not strong enough to withstand its leftist and indeed Marxist temptations. Even if it may or may not have been a good doctrine in and of itself, liberalism perforce collapses, surrenders, and ultimately embraced and embraces tyrannical authoritarian leftism, giving you all the ills we all once thought we fought and defeated. You want to yield to a world of sweatshops and child labor and racism and bigotry, you must first renounce or devalue natural right. Or, as Goldwater and Jefferson put it, the laws of nature and nature's God. You want a postulate illustrating liberalism's weakness when it comes to authoritarian and tyrannical dictatorship? In 1952, Irving Kristol wrote this about the condemnations of Joseph McCarthy. He wrote, "For there is one thing that the American people know about Senator McCarthy. He, like them, is unequivocally anti-communist. About the spokesman for American liberalism, they feel they know no such thing, and with some justification." Let's not be ashamed of or shrink from all that. It's the noblest place to be, conservatism. Ever and always. I'm Seth. I'll be right back.